Hello, I'm Meia Nouwens, IISS Senior Fellow for Chinese Security and Defense Policy and host of the IISS Sound Strategic Podcast. In today's episode, we're going to discuss the status and future trajectory of European defense and look back on the main takeaways from the IISS Prague Defence Summit, which is held from the 8th to the 10th of November in the Czech Republic. We'll cover the trends in European and NATO defense spending and what's next given the Trump election victory in the recent US presidential election. We'll also talk about the trends in military procurement and challenges to building readiness, such as the speed at which capability is fielded. Lastly, we'll touch on the challenges Europe faces in securing rare earth elements and critical raw minerals that are vital to defense production, and discuss what's being done already and what's on the horizon for European security of supply. Joining me on the show are four of my colleagues: Dr. Ben Schreer, Executive Director of IISS Europe and Director of the Defense Technology and Future Conflict Programs; Fenella McGerty, Senior Fellow for Defense Economics; Tom Waldwyn, Research Associate for Defense Procurement; and Ester Sabatino, Research Associate for Defense and Military Analysis. Ben, Fenella, Tom, and Esther, welcome onto the show. Ben, starting with you, what was the significance of holding the Prague Defence Summit this year, and what was the main outcome?
Thanks, Meia. I think it was really important to have this meeting at this time for European defense. As we all know, the Ukraine is coming under intense and increasing pressure to stop the Russian attacks, and there's a real prospect that defensive lines in the Ukraine will come under even more stress. And secondly, we have had the US election, and with that outcome, the real prospect of even more pressure on the Europeans to fend for themselves and to assume an even much greater responsibility for their own defenses. So we thought it would be a very good timing to bring together political, military, and defense industry leaders to gather in Prague and discuss these critical issues for European defense. I think the outcome was very positive. We had very intense, concentrated, focused, and sober conversations about various aspects of European defense. We welcomed 215 delegates from 31 countries and 4 international organizations. Importantly, not just countries from NATO Europe, but also from outside the region, so including from the Indo-Pacific and the Middle East.
And for those of us who weren't there in person, what was the atmosphere like in the room?
The atmosphere was very focused, sober in terms of the challenges at hand. A lot of concerns over, the future of Ukraine, the implications for Europe as a result of the US elections. Significant concerns over also the collapse of the German governing coalition and what that might mean for Europe's largest continental power, the future of the Zeitenwende. I think there was also a recognition in the room that while we have made some progress in terms of strengthening European defense capabilities since the war started in February 2022, we still have a very long way to go. And I think the room was rather, shall we say, holding their breath of whether European leaders will be able and willing to continue that political momentum, but also the financial ability to underwrite what will be a long-term effort to rebuilding European defense capability.
Fenella, in terms of defense spending, how much progress have European countries and NATO allies made in order to support greater defense investment moving forward? And how sustainable are the shifts that you've seen?
Thanks, Meia. I think a key message is that progress so far has been impressive, but there is still a way to go, as Ben said as well. Over the last 10 years, we've seen European NATO member spending increase by 50%, with a lot of that funding allocated to investment, so procurement and R&D, which has increased from 16% on average a decade ago to over 30% today. And some countries it's even higher, closer to 40% in countries like Finland and Poland. So that's enabled a lot of recapitalization, increased production, new programs, capabilities. However, the focus is now on readiness. The flip side of the shift to investment is that personnel spending dropped considerably as a proportion of budgets from 60 to 40%. And the O&M spending share, operations and maintenance spending share, remained about the same. It's fairly stagnant, so only slightly higher now. And that's really impacted readiness. Personnel numbers have lowered, training funding has been constrained. So now there is the question of whether certain countries in Europe can effectively operate these new capabilities, deploy at speed for a prolonged duration. So this as ever requires greater amount of money. And there are, as you say, very real concerns about the pressures on European defence spending and how sustainable this level of growth is. We've seen wider public spending cuts, increased taxation in the recent budgets of key spenders like France and the UK, for instance, but defence was ring-fenced. So there are costs to other areas of spending. And that's only going to magnify over time, given the serious projections from the IMF that when you combine higher defence spending with costs for climate change mitigation and the higher costs associated with an ageing population in terms of health and social spending, that's going to account for 5.5% of GDP in major European economies and 8.5% in the more emerging economies. So it's substantial, and it might actually impact the rate of growth of future spending in Europe, with countries struggling to close fiscal deficits and incurring the attention in terms of EU's excessive deficit procedures and things like that. So we are seeing the emergence of different kinds of funding, off-budget mechanisms, but also looking towards the private sector to try and bolster funding for defence.
And what do you think the recent election outcome in the United States presidential election will mean for European and NATO defense spending moving forward? Trump has been quite vocal about this in the past. So what are your expectations?
I think the pressure will certainly increase, and therefore it's going to be increasingly important and difficult for countries to continue maintaining those increases. I think while the projections aren't as clear at the moment, we don't have long-term financing plans for a lot of the countries in terms of defence. I think what will emerge is that countries will not be able to return to lower levels of spending. Where there have been commitments to increases over time, they will need to be adhered to. One of the drawbacks is if the pressure and the focus becomes entirely on how much countries are spending as a proportion of GDP, because that ignores the capabilities and the contributions that these countries make to NATO in different ways, and also encourages countries to increase the other areas of spending that fall into defence, which decreases transparency. So the pressure actually detracts from effective defence spending increases and capability investment, because the focus is all on that top line. It's not actually where the funding is going.
Tom, moving on to procurement, what are the trends that you've seen in European defense procurement since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022?
Over the last 3 years, there's been a massive increase in equipment acquisition. Our numbers show that from that month in 2022 up until the end of September of this year, NATO European countries have signed production contracts worth over $180 billion for quite a broad range of systems. And just over half of this value, about 52%, were for European systems, about 34% for US systems, and then the remainder for Brazilian, Israeli, and Korean systems. This is a significant increase in some areas, not just on the 3 years before 2022, but in some cases on the 10 years leading up to 2022. I mean, in armored fighting vehicles, it's over $27 billion worth of contracts by these countries. Artillery, howitzers, and multiple rocket launchers, it's over $15 billion. Surface-to-air missile systems, it's over $39 billion. For the artillery and air defense, it's over 2 times greater or more than the value of similar production contracts placed in the 10 years leading up to 2022. So you can see how a lot of activity is, some of it's come to fruition during this time frame, but a lot of decisions and programs and requirements have been accelerated because of the deteriorating security situation. And we also see greater sort of penetration of the European market, if you like, by Brazilian companies, greater by Israeli companies. Okay, they've operated in Europe for quite a while, but certainly their business in Europe has increased over the last few years. And then, of course, Korean companies, particularly in Poland, which comprises the vast majority of the value of their contracts. And there's a variety of reasons for this, but one of the key ones is the speed at which they can deliver, as opposed to a longer-term joint development project. Another interesting development is that an increasing number of these programs are now at the government-to-government level. You've got countries cooperating more when acquiring equipment. Germany launched the European Sky Shield initiative in order to better coordinate air defense requirements in Europe, to align procurement in that way. And that has led to quite a few European countries procuring air defense systems, in some cases of the kind that they've never had before. Through that mechanism, there are other similar initiatives underway which have led to similar outcomes.
And what were the challenges identified in the strategic dossier written for the Prague Defence Summit, and indeed at the Prague Defence Summit, in terms of ramping up production of military equipment to meet greater demand?
There was a lot of talk at the summit about speed and how quickly these things can happen, and particularly the balance between what European countries have been doing for the last 30 years, which is acquiring very, what you might call exquisite systems, which are 100% of the solution, therefore are much more technically complex and take longer to develop and are more expensive, as opposed to what countries are now thinking about, which is going for 60%, getting a capability fielded a lot more quickly, and then spiraling up development to eventually get you to 90% or 100% over the lifetime of the program. And so there was a lot of talk at the summit about the bureaucratic impediments that countries sort of impose on themselves, if you like. And I think one of the speakers talked about a paper army that countries have to fight against in that respect. There's definitely a lot more thinking to be done actually about practically how you balance some of the regulations and the processes and the oversight that countries have against a deteriorating security situation where speed is much more important. But generally, ramping up productions, there's been a lot of success, but there have been a lot of challenges to that. For example, the larger prime contractor will have finances available to make changes in the short term, hire some extra workers, put on a few extra shifts. But the issue is not so much with them, it's with the supply chain underneath, the smaller companies, the medium-sized companies. And it's a supply chain which has shrunk over the last 30 years because of the reduced demand and the reduced spending, and also the procurement approach that countries have taken. So you'll often hear from those larger prime contractors and say, well, we've done what we can, but we're actually waiting for the companies in the supply chain to be able to catch up. And ultimately, you can't really get there until those production contracts are signed and investment starts flowing down. And then another problem is where defense companies are competing in a way against the commercial sector, because they're after the same parts, they're after the same materials. If you think of microelectronics, if you think of automotive parts, certain chemicals, even power supply. If you want to establish a new factory, there are instances out there where, a non-defense company has actually been given power off the local network instead of a defense company, which obviously has implications for a country's defense industrial capability. France has probably gone furthest on this, I think, in terms of legislation to force companies to do things, but there's definitely a lot more work to be done. And then a third challenge, not so much in the short term at the moment, but in the longer term, and there's been a lot of thinking on this in the US, less so in Europe, but now beginning, is where some of this stuff is actually coming from, particularly from countries who are supporting Russia's war effort. You think of the reliance on China for nitrocellulose production, which is crucial to ammunition supply. That's definitely an area that European countries are thinking a lot more about and trying to think of how to move that supply into Europe or into other friendly countries so that the supply is a lot more secure.
Speaking to that supply chain issue, Esther, one of the challenges, as was just mentioned, for Europe that was discussed at the Prague Defence Summit is about that issue of security and of supply, in particular, the supply of raw materials and critical minerals that are crucial to defense production. Can you speak a little bit more to this challenge and what's being done to address this?
Thank you, Meia. So yes, the security of supply and dependence on raw materials are a particular problem for the European defense sector. There was an identification of 39 different raw materials that are necessary for defense, and 22 of which are deemed to be critical raw materials. The Commission also shared that of these 22 critical raw materials, European countries import 100% of 19 of them. Also, the source of the country where these natural resources are available is particularly relevant, as China, for example, provides 98% of the EU supply for rare earth elements. Rare earth elements are not all necessary for the defense production, but I think that this data depicts well what are the dependencies at stake. Security of supply, however, does not only include the proper availability of the materials, and it involves also the distribution of defense and defense-related products. That can be affected, as Tom was referring to, by uncoordinated demand, fragmented market production capacity, different standardization and certification mechanisms, as well as different regulations for the exchange of this product that prevent timely and efficient provision of materials. This was illustrated quite well by the crisis of ammunition production, where national legislations and approaches have proven to be bottlenecks for this. So what have European countries done? During the Prague Defence Summit, we heard in the third plenary session Sweden State Secretary Johan Berggren focusing on improving the security of supply and involving the private sector through greater production flexibility, increasing stockpiling, or continuing the process of de-risking. We also heard French General Giraud mentioning the investment of increasing number of stockpiles and spare parts, particularly through a law which allows the government to force the industry to have a certain level of stockpiles and raw materials for some equipment. At the European level, on the diversification of sources for critical raw materials, there have been some initiatives in the past, although they are not specific for defense. And one of these is, in particular, is the Critical Raw Materials Act, which focuses on improving the domestic production in Europe and focuses also on friendshoring. Strategic partnerships with third countries are also considered to be positive efforts in these regards, while at the NATO level, Defense Critical Supply Chain Security Roadmap looks at making recommendations on how to do this kind of stockpilings for relevant raw materials. Also, the aggregation of demand from the Allied side is particularly relevant when it comes to these issues, and this has been recently addressed by the NATO Defense Production Action Plan. At the EU level again, on trying to support urgent orders and prioritization mechanisms, there have been some activities in the past, but particularly in the framework of the European Defence Agency and of the LOI framework agreement, which do not constitute binding commitments. To improve the timely availability of the products, towards the end of the 2000s, so in 2009, the EU also published a new intra-community transfer directive to speed up the transfer among member states. The problem here is that each European country has transposed the directive in different ways, and so it is still complex to have a good intra-community transfer. Next steps to address the challenge: the Letta report on the single market, the Draghi report on competitiveness, as well as the Ministro report on preparedness and readiness. They all three, in a way, reference and suggest how to move forward to address issues regarding critical raw materials and problems in the supply chain that all go towards the direction of a swift implementation of the European Defence Industrial Strategy and the Industrial Programme. Very briefly on the initiatives included in the industrial program, there is the proposed creation of a EU-wide security supply regime to enhance the coordination of responses to supply crises for defense products and to increase also the trust among member states when it comes to these issues. So according to the proposal, there is also the identification and monitoring of critical products for certain defense supply chains that are going to be identified by member states and are proposed board inside the Commission. Other initiatives relate also to funds to accelerate the transformation of the supply chain, particularly when it comes to small and medium-sized enterprises, or to extend the logic of instruments such as EDIRPA and ASAP to sustain the improvement of the defense industrial base. These instruments are still under discussion at member state level. So we do not know how in the end they will make it through and what will be available at EU level to address, on the one hand, the lack of raw materials, and on the other side, the strengthening of the security of supply and of the supply chain.
That's all we have time for today, so thank you Ben, Fenella, Tom, and Esther for sharing your insights, and thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode. You can find more information on the topics discussed in today's episode in our show notes. Please do follow, rate, and subscribe to Sound Strategic wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts to keep up to date with all the latest episodes. Thank you and see you next time.